So thankful to see you today. We're thankful to be together and thankful for the purpose of being able to worship God together. We thank you for that. Especially thankful if you're a guest that you would choose to be with us. Every Sunday, any Sunday is a great day for you to be with us, but today is one of the best in terms of us getting to eat afterwards. So we're thankful you've chosen to be here on this day. And we invite you to stay, even if you didn't plan to, even if you did not bring anything to eat. We'd love for you to stay and enjoy that time of fellowship, but also good eating together. And I hope that we'll have a great crowd. I know that we will, and we'll love that time together. If you will, as you go through the line this morning or this afternoon or 11:30-ish or whenever it is we go through the line, just think about that food and think thoughts of Thanksgiving for all the people who are here who provided that. But also just kind of think about the preparation steps that comes with making food in general. We'll try to kind of build on that for our lesson at 1 o'clock as well. So just think through that as you go through the line. We have much to be thankful for in terms of our physical nourishment, and we're so thankful for so many people here who cook well and love to cook, and we look forward to spending that time together. 1 o'clock worship, no 5 p.m. worship, so be sure you just hang around, stay, and we'll meet at 1 o'clock. We've had a great run, a great set of lessons on Wednesday nights for our parenting classes. I know this is kind of the sick time of year, but this Wednesday would be a really good time to kind of recommit or be sure that you're here as we'll wrap up some things about discipline, but also take some time to talk about an exercise that'll really help us in terms of big picture. I'm excited about that. And then we'll introduce raising children in this digital era. So a very pertinent, relevant kind of topic to address. A great time to come back or come for the first time or just recommit on this Wednesday beginning at 6. Hope you'll be here for that. There was a 29-year-old man in prison, northern Spain. I'll read you his name. Gonzalo Jimenez. Gonzalo Jimenez, 29-year-old prisoner, northern Spain. He did not show up for that morning check, first thing in the morning outside of their cells. And so they rushed to his room. They found him unconscious and with no signs of life. He was carried from the prison to the hospital. And in the hospital, he was pronounced dead, not by one, not by two, but by 3 different doctors. And they wheeled him down from the hospital to the morgue. And while he was there in the morgue, they drew on him, his face and his body, where they would make incisions to perform the autopsy. And about 4 hours after he had been pronounced dead, the medical examiner, who was getting things in order in part to carry out various autopsies, including his, heard a really strange sound. It was Mr. Jimenez snoring. After being pronounced dead by 3 doctors, somehow his vital signs had improved and they were just undetectable at the time, and now he was somehow in this state of being kind of awakened. His family would go on to say later that he did have kind of epileptic disorder, which probably played into his condition and played into his vital signs being so low they were immeasurable. They thought he was dead, but in truth he was actually alive. Those stories are kind of fascinating, aren't they? We hear about them from time to time. We can get really close to death and not really be dead. We don't still, in all of our technology, there's no surefire, bulletproof kind of way to pronounce someone dead. We're pronounced dead when we're dead. We're pronounced dead. It's just kind of the thing. And so these stories that come out from time to time about people who are actually alive, in spite of appearing dead, are fascinating. What James does in James chapter 2 is paint the opposite picture. We can appear to be alive. We can be alive physically. But in truth, he says, we can be dead. We can profess to have faith. We can have good intentions. We can say this and say that. But he says that kind of faith that is absent of works is in actuality dead. So as we move in our study of kind of profiling some Old Testament heroes that are mentioned by James, what you find in James chapter 2 is another hero of faith who's mentioned in this same context of faith working together with works, showing that God justifies, God honors, God blesses when we work, when we carry out the good works, when we are obedient to works of righteousness and submitting ourselves to Him. Listen to the context, reminding ourselves, James chapter 2. Verse 14, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? That's building common ground with his audience. That should build common ground with us, because merely saying faith or professing faith or thinking faith is not a saving faith. Only an active faith that submits with obedience to the terms where God has made it clear, this is when I save. I save at baptism. Those are truths they would have known and that we should know. He says it's that kind of thinking that will propel us to answer every kind of situation. So he continues, verse 15. If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith, and I have works. You do your thing, I'll do mine. That sound familiar? Does it ever come up in kind of religious discussions? It's kind of just been remolded and recast over the years from this statement into that. Well, let's just agree to disagree. You do things your way, I'll do things my way. Those kind of, the way of thinking. Here's what James responds to that, though, with, show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Faith and works are inseparable. We show who we trust, what we trust, when we show our active level of faith. We carry these things out, and specifically what things, the things God has commanded. Verse 19, he moves from hypothetical into real scenarios. Verse 19, you believe that God is one. Christians who are hesitant to live out their faith, even though it costs them something. Christians who are unwilling to truly bear their cross for Christ daily and follow Him. They may fall back on this reasoning. Well, I believe in God. I believe in Jesus Christ. You do believe in God. He's one. Well, then you do well. But even the demons believe, and they shudder. So do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? The takeaway must be this. This whole section reminds us that an inactive faith is the same thing as dead faith. A faith that's in word only, it's in mind only, is of no good to God. It's of no good to those who need us. It's in no good to our own souls. Only an active faith is an alive faith and a faith that God blesses. And you see that in this text, abundantly in this text. Now, what that means for us is it's not a choice between faith or works. Neither is it a competition where we must choose faith against works. Instead, it's faith working together with works. And God justifies and blesses when we are active in that faith, working together with works. When we are submissive in carrying out those spiritual desires and those commands He makes known to us. Now we drop down to our text into chapter 2, verse 25. We introduce Rahab. In the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body, apart from the spirit, is dead, so also faith, apart from works, is dead. In the same way, how he opens verse 25, obviously connecting both Rahab and Abraham together. And if you wanted to notice a first takeaway from this text, you'll notice that together, collectively, Abraham and Rahab are in contrast to the demons of verse 19. And really we could go back in the text and probably lump the demons in with that hypothetical scenario beginning in verse 15. The person who is inhospitable, who notices a need but just says, I hope you get it taken care of, and fails to act on helping that need. You see, Abraham and Rahab together, these heroes of faith, contrast the demons, and they contrast that hypothetical example. Isn't it interesting? Those demons believe, he says, but they shudder. Maybe getting a little bit of a corrective point in on Christians with that statement. The demons know that God is real. They know the truth, but they act in a way that's contrary to that truth. And yet, he says they tremble, they shudder, they are humble. What's the very next thing he says? Verse 20, Do you want to be shown, foolish person, that faith without works is useless? You can see how he's appealing to some Christians, first century, maybe even among us, maybe even us, who are failing to have an active faith. It's an in-word only faith. It's an excuse kind of laden faith. And we fail to act out of arrogance. He says these demons, they know the truth, and yet they are humbled and tremble knowing the truth about God. You keep reading in James, he's going to hit humility pretty hard, isn't he? Chapter 4 and chapter 5 both. It's all going to come down to, am I willing to humble myself before God's teaching, which is have faith, but have a faith that's always active and submissive and carrying out what God commands. But you notice also in the text, there's another level at which there is contrast. Abraham and Rahab contrast each other. Collectively, they contrast the negative examples. But when you look at each of them separately, they are as vastly different as you could imagine. They're on both ends of the spectrum. And it's worth noting here that when God talks about and writes about women, they are always elevated above what they would have been in the culture of the time. God never demeans women for being women. And in the first century, Abraham would have appealed to a mass audience, but it would have stuck out. It would have been quite unusual for people to have said, well, this woman is someone whom you should look to as an example of pleasing God. Why is that? It's because God designed and created man and woman both alike as valuable and both as necessary and needed and of high value. So here, it's no surprise you see that value honored in this text. But just notice a list of differences between Abraham and Rahab. Abraham was wealthy. He was a male. He was the father of a nation. He was a prominent figure. He walked with God for decades prior to the incident that's referenced in James chapter 2. He was tested by God, but he was tested out of his maturity. How far are you willing to trust Abraham? Clearly, he was not only a Jew, but the father of the Jews. What about Rahab? Well, she's likely poor, having to be a prostitute by trade, living in the walls of the city. She's female, immoral trade as a prostitute. She's an outcast likely of the Canaanite nation because hence she's on the outside of the wall there in the city. She's a relatively minor figure. There are only a handful of texts that reference Rahab. And it's all kind of this general context. Abraham, there are countless texts in the Bible about him, both Old Testament, especially in his life, but also pulling over into the New Testament as an example of faith. Notice this, and we'll see it in the text of Joshua 2. But she had only recently heard about God. Abraham had walked with God for decades. She has just heard about what all God has done. And now she is facing a test of trust and faith. And it's one of that initial willingness to submit and to comply. And obviously she is a pagan and related to that. She's not been raised to know Jehovah God, raised to know Yahweh God, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Bible, the God of the universe. So that contrast is important because it's by implication, but it's so powerful and it's so necessary. It makes the point that this command, this expectation, but also this opportunity is available to everyone. Would any of us ever say that, man, my faith and my wealth and my stature, they're right in line with Abraham's? You want to know the Bible character I'm most like? I am just like Abraham. Would anybody ever really think that's me? I would venture to say probably not. You take some of the depths, kind of the hitting the rock bottom aspects of Rahab's life, we're probably not going to find ourselves there either. That reputation, that public, committing a sin for a living kind of thing, that's pretty strong. We would easily find ourselves somewhere between. What's the point? All of this justification that God offers is available to everyone. Yes, it's true, everyone must work out their faith, have a faith that's active with works. But so too everyone can. Everyone has the opportunity. Now in the first century, when James is writing to these Christians, he's writing to Jews and Gentiles alike. You see the wide spectrum here. Abraham, the father of the Jews, is an example. Rahab, this recent, just having heard about the Lord, pagan, Gentile, is an example of active faith. So no matter where I find myself, I can look at this text and say, oh, there's a place for me, there's a command for me, there's an expectation of me to have an active faith. There's no way for us to kind of wiggle out of this and say, well, I'm not like them, therefore this does not apply to me. We all find ourselves on that spectrum between the two of them. There's also a doctrinal kind of implication to all this related to that, just a little deeper, theologically speaking, that God has always operated the same way in terms of how and when he justifies mankind. It's always at his offering. It's grace. It's mercy. But it's always when our faith is active with our works. And he does so when we obey, when the works happen. You see that in all three dispensations when you look at this text. When you see that in the three covenants, or the three eras kind of outlined by covenants. Abraham would have lived under the covenant he gave to Noah when Noah came off the boat. Pre-law. He justifies Abraham. He offers Abraham that relationship. When does he justify him? When he obeyed. When he was submissive with good works. Rahab's now living at a time when the law is in effect. They're moving into the promised land after having been given the law at Sinai. He rescued them, brought them across the Red Sea, offered this new covenant at Sinai. That new covenant included the laws. Well, how does God do that? In the era of Rahab, the era of the law, God still operates and justifies through our faith and works working together when we are obedient, actively submissive to him. And that's an important point for us to continue to wrestle with and see threaded throughout Scripture. That's how God operates. Therefore, we cannot choose to step back from some works. We can't choose to just make excuses and fail to act because God has always expected us to obey his commands. Now, let's notice this kind of fleshed out in the account from the Old Testament. Let's go to Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2, we'll begin reading there. Remember, Joshua is the time in which that second wave, that next generation, gets to go into the promised land. Need a little help, Alex? It's when the next generation is finally getting to go in the promised land. They've kind of blew the first time around. They've been promised it. They've been given it. And yet the first generation is rebellious. God says, you're not going to enter, but your children, grandchildren, they'll get to enter. And so now they're approaching that entrance 40 or so years later. And they have to cross the Jordan and all that. That happens beginning in chapter 3. Before that, they're knocking on the door of the promised land, and that's what happens in chapter 2. Joshua is now the leader of the people, no longer Moses. Chapter 2, verse 1. And Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, go, view the land, especially Jericho. And they went. They came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and lodged there. And it was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. Now she's going to hide the men, and the king's going to come try to find the men. And then they have a conversation later, which picks up in verse 8. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, listen to this faith. I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. And listen to your conclusion. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. She's a powerful example of how to communicate this understanding of who God is. I know what God has done. It's already going to happen. It's not happened yet, but it might as well have. He has given you the land. And she closes by saying, all of this proves to me who God is. But notice in between, when she recounts all that she's heard about God, She makes it clear it's not just her who's heard. All the inhabitants have. Even up to the king of Jericho knows there's this group of people coming and that their God has paved the way for them to be there. And within all of these inhabitants of the city of Jericho, there's fear, there's concern, there's anxiety. So they've all heard about what God has done. What makes Rahab different? She heard it. Clearly she believed it. She trusted it. How do we know? What would James tell us? Because she worked. Because she welcomed the spies. She said, you can stay here. You can hide out here. That means I believe in what I've heard. Everyone else had believed it to a degree, but only to a degree that they wanted to protect self, that they wanted to push them out, rid them out, maybe kill those two spies. They didn't hear it and be convinced of it enough to change. But she heard it and believed it. How do you know? Because she acted on it by welcoming them into her house. She knew. It was clear she knew that God was an active God. You hear the active terms in that text? What did God do? He dried up. He dried up the Red Sea. He brought you out. It was you who conquered and destroyed the Amorites and took out those kings. We're not just hearing abstract qualities. We're hearing about action, an active portrayal of God. And so she had an active faith because she understood God himself by his nature was active. Now, when you look at the legacy of Rahab in James 2 that we've already read, and then we'll read in a moment Hebrews 11, when you look at those passages together, you'll see that her legacy is tied to what we've just read. The fact that she welcomed the spies. Now, these principles apply to later things. When she was told to drop the rope and told to keep her family inside the house, to not tell. But her faith is tied directly to her welcoming the spies and keeping them safe in her house. And isn't that interesting? In light of some of the conversations James is having with us. James chapter 2. Don't hold the faith in partiality. She had every reason, if she was going to remain in good standing in Jericho and in the land of Canaan, to rid them out, to hold them in partiality, to say, no, I'm not going to trust these guys. I don't know what they're up to. But she did not hold them in partiality. Instead, she welcomed them. Why? Because she had a faith, and a faith that was strong enough to act. What example does he use in James 2 that we read? If somebody comes to you, they are in need of clothes or in need of food, and you welcome them, you're hospitable. See, the person who does not is useless. Well, she is proving to be useful. Why? Because she welcomed with hospitality these outsiders. It's truly an active and an activated faith that we see on display in the life of Rahab when she welcomed the spies. You look on further in the text, we won't take the time to read it. But there you find more of their conversation, and she says, can you help me? Can you preserve us, keep us safe when you come and attack the city? And that comes out of faith because she understands God's going to allow them to take this land, to take this city. And so they say, yes, if you will not tell, if you will drop the scarlet rope out of your window, and if you will stay in your house, we will give you safety. If you violate any of those terms, then your blood is not on our hands. So verse 21, just listen to the short, simple, concise picture of what James is praising in James chapter 2. Joshua 2, verse 21, she hears these conditions for this agreement where they will rescue her. And all she says is, according to your words, so be it. According to your words, so be it. What kind of faith does God honor? A faith that says, according to your words, so be it. What kind of works does God honor? Works that are built on that statement of truth. According to your words, so be it. And so we see why Rahab is elevated and brought to this stature of one who is an example of faith that's rewarded and honored by God because it is an active, working, obedient faith. And you'll notice her keeping the conditions that they gave her didn't demean the offer at all. It didn't demean God's offer to rescue her or Joshua's offer to rescue her. It didn't demean her trust, but instead it was validating. It was her accepting the terms of rescue that were offered. And so she said, according to your words, so be it. But another question coming from these texts that deal with Rahab. What happens if Rahab and her family, if she does not act? Joshua chapter 2, she hears about these spies. They come knock on her door. She looks, she sees, well, they're outsiders. Oh, they look like Israelites that I've been hearing about. And she keeps her door shut. Or she just opens it enough and says, I wish you well, but no place here, no room. What happens if she never entertains the spies? What happens if she talks to the spies and they tell her, don't tell anybody, hang the red cord, keep your people in the house? And she breaks one of those 3 conditions to the covenant. What happens if she fails to act obediently? I mean, we can kind of guess pretty clearly based on Joshua 2. But listen to how specific Joshua 6 is when you get to verse 24. Joshua 6, verse 24. And they burned the city. This is when they finally take Jericho. When they burned the city and everything in it, only the silver and gold, the vessels of bronze and of iron, and they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab, the prostitute, and her father's household, and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And then a neat translation. Not just saved, not just rescued, but saved alive. What would her reality have been had she not acted? The text says of Joshua 6, she has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. You see the harmony there? Joshua 6:25 is the same. She was rescued and saved alive because of the same reason James mentions her in chapter 2, verse 25, the same reason in Hebrews 11, verse 31 that we'll read momentarily. Clearly, Rahab dies. Her family dies. Doesn't matter how strongly she believed the report. Doesn't matter how strongly or concisely she could memorize and tell the report. If she failed to act, she would have died, and her family would have died with her. What was it James says? So faith without works is dead. Just as the body without the spirit is dead, so too faith without works is dead. Listen to Hebrews 11, verse 31, her very parallel statement to a lot of these things we've been reading. But just listen. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish. She did not die with those who were disobedient. Interesting word choice, right? Those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Again, the same set of works. She welcomed, she was hospitable, she brought them in. She's contrasted with those in Jericho, or they called disobedient. Were they unbelievers? Well, yes. How do you know? Because the text calls them disobedient. They had heard the report, they were scared of the report, but they failed to do anything that drew them to act, to please, and to find the truth about God. As we move to an application stage here, we're told very little about Rahab's emotions. Really, all we know about her emotional state and how she's kind of processing all this, she tells us herself. And she even kind of lumps herself in with the rest of Jericho. We've heard all these things about what all God has done and about what He's done through you. And we had fear because of it. Our hearts melted. Our spirit left us. So we know there's plenty of fear. And so for us to say she didn't have any fear would be inaccurate. But the truth is she feared the best fear. Her fear was healthy in the right direction. She feared the Lord more than she feared anything else. Did it take her tremendous courage to tell her family this? Did it take her courage to stand out among the inhabitants of Jericho? Might they try to kill her before they take the land? You see how it was risky to believe this, but she overcame those fears because she feared the Lord more than any of those other external fears. Imagine how scary it was when the moment actually began to happen. When she hears and sees Israelites come, and okay, it's rubber meets the road time. Now she's got to leave. She's got to decide once and for all. Fear, no doubt, would have been there. She chose the right, healthy perspective of fear. So too, as we think about our own faith and especially activating that faith, you ever paused and thought about how often it's fear, maybe some specific fears, some specific what-ifs that get in our way and cause us to put things off or cause us to not do things? If we ask the question, what if I do whatever it is? You know how paralyzing that can be? Well, what if Rahab would have spent a lot of time saying, well, what if I do what they say? It's going to complicate this. It's going to complicate this. It's going to cost me this. It's going to do this. It's going to do that. But if she asks the question, what if I don't? What if I don't act on what I know to be true and what I've heard and what I believe? What happens then? That's what James is telling us. You cannot allow any fear to stand in the way of your faith being activated. What if you don't? It's death. Your life, your soul is already dead despite your physical body being alive. Matthew 8:26. The disciples are on board the boat. The sea is raging around them. Jesus is asleep. What's his response? Why are you afraid, O you of little faith? You hear the contrast? Your life is so full of being afraid and cowardice that you only have room for little faith. That kind of fear, unhealthy fear, was at direct odds with their faith, and it impacted their faithfulness. Paul would tell Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 1, you need to use this gift you've been given. Don't be cowardly, because God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power, of love, self-control. Act. Don't fail to act, but instead act. Why? Because God didn't intend for you to walk around afraid of all the circumstances, but instead act with your faith. So, you think about last week. We challenged ourselves just to listen to myself. What excuses am I making? What kind of things do I tell myself that keep me from doing what I know I need to do? Keep me from not doing, maybe stopping some things that I am living out in terms of sin perhaps? You know, when I listen to my self-talk and how I try to justify some things and make excuses, what good works am I not living out? Did you make a list last week? Think of one or two or a handful of things? If you can access that list once again, and we move in this direction where we kind of started with Rahab just a moment ago, ask this question. I need to ask, what if I don't? What if I don't ever get around to doing whatever that is? What if I just keep putting it off? Keep finding a someday on the calendar? What happens? See, healthy fear asks, what if I don't, therefore I will do it. But unhealthy fear will keep asking, what if I do and it's hard and it hurts and it costs? What if I don't? What if I don't do that? So let's use that question to help us today and this week as we think about living out the good works that God would have us to because we trust in Him completely. Maybe for you this morning, maybe it's obeying the gospel in baptism. That's the thing you know you need to do. What happens if you don't act on it this morning? What happens if we don't act on it today? What happens if we don't ever get around to acting on it? Maybe coming back to Him. We've stepped away from Him. We've not been living with these good works. We've not been pleasing Him. Same question. What if we don't ensure that our lives are right with Him today, this moment? What if we don't ever get around to making our lives right with Him and repenting in a public way? Please know that this opportunity is to help us, to give us all that opportunity to be sure our lives are right with Him. Whether that's through baptism, whether that's through public repentance, or whether you need prayers for something else. Please know that we're here for you, and we love you, and we know that God loves you as well. If you have those needs, would you come and come as we sing?